What is going on, guys? It is WrestleGamia here, back with another video. Well, the verdicts are in on 2K20, and as you might expect, they're not good. With all the bugs, performance issues and missing features, it seems that this year's edition in the 2K series is destined for the bargain bin somewhere near you very soon. Reviews have been unanimously awful, with some going as far as to call it the worst wrestling game in WWE history. But is that true? Now, whilst we agree that the game has a lot of major problems and is in many ways an unmitigated disaster, but worst WWE wrestling game ever? Not quite. Over the years, there's been some real stinkers that makes this one look a lot better by comparison. So many in fact that, wouldn't you know it, we've been able to make a helpful list for you all, so you never find yourself accidentally purchasing them in search of an alternative to this year's game. So be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell, because today we're going to look at 6 WWE wrestling games worse than 2K20. The games are in no particular order, they're just all terrible. Number 1. WWF Raw for Xbox and PC. Let's start off with this 2002 effort from THQ. It's not one of the most fondly remembered WWE games, as Raw was originally going to be titled Raw's War, but had to be changed at the last minute following the September 11th attacks. As if that wasn't a bad enough omen to start with, maybe they just should have called it a day there. Upon release, the Metacritic average reviews for the game fell at an average 68 out of 100 for the Xbox version, and an even more depressing 54 out of 100 for the PC version. More specifically, reviews singled out its gameplay, feeling like a chore as momentum build-up by a player could be lost with one strike from an opponent, causing matches to go on forever. Other issues were the overly difficult and fiddly control system, poor sound quality, unnatural-looking graphics, limited movesets which left character with the same basic strikes and grapples, and probably the biggest complaint by fans was that many of the features touted to be in the game's release were not available, such as a story mode or backstage areas. Hell, we only got 2 arenas, Raw's War and King of the Ring. Suffice to say, fans were not happy with the game, but nowadays it's mostly a forgotten relic, which is probably for the best, to be honest. The only thing that this game should be noted for is the first official game to change from WWF to WWE during its release. Yep, that's all. Number 2. WWE Crush Hour. Now, technically this one isn't a wrestling game, and is instead classed as a vehicular combat game, in the same vein as the likes of Twisted Metal or Carmageddon. But it's so bad we had to include it here. The concept of the game is that the genetic jackhammer himself, Vince McMahon, has taken control of all television, sounds like more of a reality, and is now able to have his superstars appear on any show he wants. This honestly sounds like Vince's dream and isn't a terrible idea, but the execution left a lot to be desired. In-game, Crush Hour is presented as the newest show on the block, featuring WWE superstars taking part in a destructive demolition derby. Each of the 30+ wrestlers included featured their own custom cars with guns as primary weapons, as well as optional secondary foreign weapons. Special moves were also available to do that extra bit of damage. But when the game was eventually released by THQ for PlayStation 2 and GameCube in 2003, reviews were scathing, with the worst among them describing the in-game physics and car handling as pathetic and the battles as tedious with little variation. Now, to be fair, the game was a budget release, costing only £20 but there's still no excuse for a game this poor if you're going to be charging anything for it. Ironically, the best takedown of Crush Hour came from the lads MAXIM, not usually known for their wit. They ended their review by saying, "If this is indeed what The Rock's been cooking all this time, we'll happily drive his lame ass back to the kitchen." Are we sure Visual Concepts didn't develop this one too? Number 3. WWE AFTERSHOCK. It's unlikely many of you out there got a chance to play WWE AFTERSHOCK, as it was an N-Gage exclusive, so only 4 people managed to play it. However, those who did were not best pleased with what they found when they loaded it up. The 2005 game by Exient Entertainment was blasted for being an unforgivably bad excuse for a wrestling game, with the core gameplay being shrunk down to just a couple of button presses and providing no satisfaction for players. The graphics were also criticized for being wooden and boxy, and reviewers bemoaned the lack of additional features like Create a Wrestler, as well as there being a playable roster of only 12. It was deemed a miss by wrestling fans, despite it being the only wrestling game available on the N-Gage at the time. It wasn't all bad though. Most reviewers did single out the game sound as good, but unfortunately this was too little and wasn't enough to make it in any way playable. Number 4. WWF European Rampage Tour. The oldest game on the list, WWF European Rampage Tour, was released by Arc Developments way back in 1992 for Amiga, Atari, Commodore 64 and MS-DOS. Now, is there anyone in the comments down below who's old enough to remember those systems? But as you can guess from the list, the limitations of the time meant that by today's standards, the game would be unlikely to hold up, but even back in the day, fans were unhappy with what they had been sold. This game was so basic that it didn't even allow for singles matches. Players could pair up with friends or play alongside an NPC to team as a combination of Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, The Ultimate Warrior, or Bret the Hitman Hart, and would have to go through a gauntlet of matches against the Nasty Boys, the Natural Disasters and Money Inc. before reaching the final bosses of the Legion of Doom. This was unless you played the Commodore version, which for some reason only included singles matches and left your character of the choice to go up against Jerry Sags, Typhoon, Owen R. Shyster and Animal from their respective teams. As noted previously, the game was held back by the limitations of the time and only allowed players to use a basic moveset, though it did allow them to fight with weapons, interestingly enough. Existing reviews of the game are sparse today, but those that remain have gone as far as to describe it as a cheap cash grab and say that it proves wrestling just doesn't work as a video game, something that the genre would later have to fight to overcome the stigma of. This would be in fact the last WWF game released for home computers until WWF with Authority dropped in 2001 for Windows. Number 5. WWF WrestleMania Steel Cage Challenge. Released just after European Rampage Tour, WWF WrestleMania Steel Cage Challenge hit stores for Nintendo in 1992 and for both Sega Master System and Game Gear in 1993. The game was developed by Acclaim Entertainment and featured a significantly improved character list as well as increased match options. Each console effort features singles, tag team, the infamous Steel Cage, and championship matches, and had 10 playable wrestlers. Though there were some differences in characters depending on which version you got, with Jake the Snake Roberts, the Mountie, Rowdy Roddy Piper and Sid Justice being exclusive to the Nintendo version, while Papa Shango, Ric Flair, Shawn Michaels and Tatanka were all exclusive to the Sega game. While it was better received than the previous entry on the list, once again, the limitations of the time contributed towards the game being poorly reviewed, with the most common complaints being the extremely limited moveset that was the same no matter who you played as and difficult controls. Still, despite this, it did have some degree of cult following as it was released in 2018 as a handheld game under the new title of WWE WrestleMania Steel Cage Challenge, with the addition of 2 new playable characters, Razor Ramon and the Ultimate Warrior. Players who got a chance to experience it for the first time then probably got a glimpse into just how hard fans had it back in the day. Maybe the 2K series isn't so bad after all in comparison. And number 6, WWE 2K15. It turns out despite its faults, 2K20 isn't even the worst game in the series. Unfortunately, that honour goes to WWE 2K15. Previous developers of the 2K series Ukes released the game back at the tail end of 2014 for both 7th and 8th generation Sony and Microsoft consoles, as well as for Windows, Android and iOS, and attempted to take the series away from its arcade-style gameplay roots and into something they pitched as more realistic and sports-like. The decision was not met with much positivity. Current-gen gamers will likely remember the disappointment of playing this one for themselves, as it was easily the weakest in the 2K series to date upon release. Reviews criticised the downgrade from the previous year's roster and single-player experience, with some even suggesting they'd buy 2K14 instead and use the custom creation suite for any new roster members they needed. Others described the My Career mode as an absolute slog and the changing gameplay style as leaving them with much slower paced and less exciting gameplay. This pace matched the overall lazy feel of the production, with inconsistencies such as Goldust missing his trademark entrance, despite this being in previous editions of the game, and the sudden inability to hold a submission move on after a rope break. So it's good to remember that it could always be worse, and despite this year's edition being wildly loathed, it isn't an absolute rock bottom for the 2K series, though that isn't much of a consolation for those who already shelled out the full price for 2K20 on release day. But there you have it guys, 6 WWE wrestling games worse than 2K20. Be sure to leave your comments down below on any other games that are worse than these, follow us on Instagram, and I'll see you next time with some more wrestling video game content.